Kia ora anō tātou, I'm Mānia Clarke and welcome to End Zone Focus. As we look forward to celebrating this year's bicentennial of the first gospel message being preached at Hohi Bay in Northland, we remember the people who were actually there, listening to Reverend Marsden 200 years ago. John King is a descendant of one of those missionary families, and I will be talking to him shortly. We also hear from Hugh Rihari, who's from Rangihoua Pā, which hosted those first missionary families. And later on in the program, I talk with Reverend Emilia Tewhiu from the Tiaka Puaho o Te Taitokirau, which is the Presbyterian Māori ministry in Northland. And we talk about her role of ministering to Northland Māori today. In December 1814, the ship Active put down its anchor in Hohi Bay in Northland, having travelled across the Tasman from Australia. Included in the people on board were the Reverend Samuel Marsden and 3 missionary families who'd been invited here to share their skills and the gospel with Māori. John King was the head of one of those pioneering families, and his great-great-grandson joined me in the studio to share his knowledge of that historic event. Kia ora, John King. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation and joining me in the studio today for a chat.
I'm happy to be here, Mānia.
Thank you. Now, John, you're a descendant of one of the lay missionaries, artisans, who came with, travelled with Reverend Samuel Marsden to Aotearoa Christmas Day 1814, where he preached the first gospel message. Now that would have taken a very courageous person to come and bring his family, leave his country and effectively live in another culture.
And I think you put it very well, and I don't think a lot of people realised just what an achievement it was just coming to New Zealand. I mean, New Zealand was in its raw state, you might say, and there were all the stories of tribal warfare and that sort of thing. But it demonstrates just how much progress Marsden had made in talking to the Maori chiefs, the people he respected and admired. But nevertheless, those missionaries to come across the world and live with the Maori people, certainly they were very courageous.
Can you tell us what you understand as to what led up to those events for them coming to Aotearoa?
Well, Marsden had built a relationship with some of the outstanding Maori chiefs, Te Pahi in particular, and Te Pahi had travelled to Australia. The Maori were very open and innovative, so they had been to Sydney, they had seen Governor King. So Te Pahi was well known to Marsden, and Marsden had developed a genuine affection for Maori, and admiration is probably a better word. And he saw the opportunity to bring the word of God and the gospel to New Zealand. Te Pahi had shown interest in Christianity, because after all, Marsden was a minister in Sydney as well as a magistrate. So Marsden's task was to get the Church Missionary Society to support him. Went back to England, found 2 missionaries, my great-great-grandfather John King and William Hall, and then there was another one joined him later on, Kendall, and they were the 3 missionaries that eventually accompanied Marsden to live in New Zealand. Marsden, of course, himself didn't live in New Zealand. He accompanied them on that first visit. Hence the reference to bicentennials, December 1814, and our bicentennial is not far away.
Now, once they arrived at Rangihoua, how did they adjust to life practically here, there, I should say, amongst the people?
Well, you can imagine it would have been very strange and very difficult. They were certainly very encouraged by their faith, and of course they did know some of the Maori people. Ruatara was on the ship that travelled from London to Sydney. When the missionaries came out, by chance Ruatara was on the ship, so John King and William Hall would have known Ruatara. And there was a lot of confidence in the warmth of that arrival. The Maori people were very welcoming. There was no conquest. This was something arranged with Maori. They were there living under Rangihoua Pā, Ruatara's Pā. Ruatara, of course, unfortunately died very shortly after they arrived. But they lived under the protection of the local chiefs. And I think when you read a little bit and you read about how the missionaries talked to the chiefs and what they talked about, not just at that time, but in later times, there obviously was a rapport. But they were tough times, though. There was a real clash of cultures, obviously. But their role was to introduce the benefits of European civilization. Ruatara had hoped to see Maori benefit from what they learnt from the missionaries. And that was the backdrop for the missionaries spreading the word of God, that they would be there helping Maori. The first school, the first farm, the first cow, the first horse, the beginnings of production of te reo in written form. I mean, a lot was being achieved in a very short period of time.
And I understand there was a special relationship between Ruatara's iwi, or people, family, whānau, and your whānau, your ancestor.
Yes, there's a story of one of Ruatara's grandchildren, I think. I think it might have been after the death of this little girl's parents. I don't recall that at the moment. But anyhow, they approached the King family and asked if she could live with them. And she did. And that's where, of course, it's not just the missionaries, but the missionaries' wives come into play. All the things that Hannah King, for example, would be teaching the Maori girls. After all, the Maori boys and girls were going to school, but then there was the domestic side, sewing and that sort of thing. So there was a lot going on, but at the beginning it must have been very difficult. I don't think it was till 1816 that they really had their own house. Before that, I think they had some makeshift accommodation which everyone lived. So yes, tough times, and the fact that they survived, and people could see that they survived, and that the Maori and the Europeans, for all the difficulties, could live together, that sent a big message. There would have been no subsequent missions if it hadn't worked out the way it did.
And are you able to tell us from the missionaries' perspective what that Christmas Day, that first Christian service, would have been like?
I think the service itself must have been quite impressive. I mean, Ruatara himself, the day before Christmas Day, had prepared the altar and the cloth, had prepared the seating for the Europeans and where the Maori people would sit. And it must have been quite an impressive moment. So putting myself into their position, I think it would have been very powerful. Very religious people, and I think it must have made a huge impact to see Maori and Pākehā together with Marsden's sermon. Wonderful.
Great. Now you have such a strong legacy to the first gospel message that was preached, and you're part of a bicentenary partnership project called the Rangihoua Heritage Park to ensure that that legacy lives on for the rest of the nation and many generations to come. Tell us about that.
Well, the bicentennial is important, but New Zealanders wouldn't know. Not many people know even where Marsden Cross is, or even have heard of Marsden Cross. So for the bicentennial, the Marsden Cross Trust Board was set up, and we're developing the Rangihoua Heritage Park. Our park is right where the missionaries came. It sits next to the Marsden Cross Reserve and Rangihoua Pā, sits between them. So you get this whole area, this historic area. And at the moment, as you've seen, we have an entry building, which is quite a unique structure. But the key to our park is the history trail. Down the Marsden Cross pathway from the hill down to the beach, there will be this wonderful trail where you'll be able to stop and read the history, the story of those early times. And there will be panels with that sort of appearance. They will be very informative and yet put together by experienced people with bits that you can read. Some will read them all, some won't. But the story's there, and the objective is to bring the story and the history to New Zealand. As I said, it's sad that people don't know about 1814, and yet that's when it all happened. The first European families arrived, the Christian service, Christianity was introduced, all the firsts that I've referred to. And the nature of the beginning, the warmth of that accord between Ruatara and Marsden. Our beginnings were warm. It's a wonderful story, and it's just unfortunate that it's little known. And we've developed this park in collaboration with our iwi friends, the hapu there, Ngāti Torahina, have been with us all the way through, and we've had great support from Maori. So it truly is a bicultural park. And I think, well, our objective is to inform New Zealanders. New Zealanders should know their history. That beginning of that special relationship with Maori is a warm and powerful story.
Well, John, I'm certainly looking forward to seeing the finished product with the Rangihoua Heritage Park, and I'm sure the rest of the nation will enjoy it as well. Ngā mihi nui ki a koe. Thank you so much for joining us today. God bless.
A pleasure. Thank you very much.
John King talking to me there, a direct descendant of one of the pioneer missionaries to Aotearoa. A few weeks ago, I had the privilege of going to Rangihoua, where I spoke to one of the descendants of that pā, Hugh Rihari, who shared what life was like for his tūpuna, Ruatara, his ancestor, and the special relationship between Ruatara and Samuel Marsden.
Ko mate kā te maunga, ko Rangihoua te kāinga, ko te maurire te waka, ko Ngāti Torahina te hapu, ko Hugh Rihari taku ingoa. He whanaunga hau kia Ruatara. We are related to Ruatara. He lived on the pā behind, Rangihoua Pā. The quarter of our tūpuna that he was very industrious. He used to spend much of his time sitting on the hills around here, contemplating the day that he would join the fishing or the whaling or sailing ships that were calling into the port here for provisions. As a young lad, he fulfilled part of that dream, if you like, when he went to Parramatta, New South Wales, with Te Pahi, who lived on the island across there. Now, Te Pahi is a matua to Ruatara, and in 1805 they sailed at the invitation of the Premier of New South Wales at the time, probably in thanks for the services that they had given to the sailing ships that came here. It must be remembered that Ruatara was a young 18-year-old when he first ventured from these waters, or from this place, in 1805. His relationship with the whaling boats became quite evident in the same year. He joined the sealing boats first. Apparently, you have to serve your apprenticeship on a sealing boat before you migrated to the whaling boats. We went a lot further, and this is what Ruatara had done. In the course of his fishing, it was always his desire to go to England to meet the king. He eventually ended up in England. When he went to go to shore, they didn't pay his wages owed to him. They kicked him off the boat. He became destitute on the wharves in England. Vagabond even. And he was picked up by Samuel Marsden, who happened to be in England at that time, taken back to his boat and brought back to Parramatta. That was the first of his many trips to Parramatta. Having arrived there, Samuel Marsden looked after him and doctored him up and introduced him to agriculture, introduced him to growing of wheat and other stuff that weren't native to New Zealand. introduced him to European gardening tools. And the more, of course, he saw of these things, the more he wanted to bring these back to his people. Once he was put on a boat and brought back to New Zealand again, he immediately got on another whaling boat and off he went again. But this time he ended up on a whaling boat, a sealing boat still, on the islands outside of North Folk Island. And it was from here that 5 Māori were put on this rocky outcrop to gather seals. And the idea was that the boat that had dropped them off would come back a couple of weeks down the track. But it didn't come back for a great number of months. And by the time it did come back, 3 of the 5 had died, and Ruatara was fortunate, though he was in very bad shape, to have survived. Again, he was taken back to Parramatta, patched up again by Samuel Marsden, and it was this relationship, through adversity, I might say, that had got them to become very, very, very close friends.
Hugh Rihari speaking there about his ancestor Ruatara. After the break, Reverend Samuel Marsden talks about her ministry amongst Northland Māori today.